Right, good evening everyone to this wonderful tiered venue, and isn't it good to see it full? It's a great privilege tonight to have all of you here. Let's not mess about with that one, but also to have our speaker. He's not new to the society. I'm not sure whether he likes to be reminded or not, but he came and talked to us, I suspect possibly in this very space before it was done up so beautifully in 2014 to talk about the Glenlivet estate. He's here tonight to talk about our space, because everyone says, well, whose land is that? Whose is that? Where did that come about? How did that come about? Well, he's come with all the answers.
Thanks, Bill. That's really set me up, wasn't it?
I forgot to tell him that bit. Anyway, no, he has a huge experience of some 35 years experience in forestry in particular. It's good to see a forester or two in amongst us here. I read this off because otherwise I'll not get it right. Started as a contractor before attending forestry college and qualifying in 1989. That was in the last century. Prior to joining Seafield and Strathspey estates in 2007, he worked for the Glenlivet estate as a forestry manager and consultant through a couple of firms of chartered surveyors, and he is involved in forestry industry representatives, holding several committee posts, including a Confer directorship, and he's been the Chief Executive Officer of the Seafield Strathspey estates for some time, and a great ally of the society. When I get stuck on something, I send off an email, Dear Will, and I'll send it off at 10 o'clock at night, and at 11 o'clock the answer comes back, because he works day and night, I believe. Anyway, who owns Strathspey is our talk, and I hope we'll get at least some of the answers to that this evening. So thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that mic's working and you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak to you this evening, and it was Bill that gave me the subject of this talk, who owns Strathspey. So I was a little bit stuck on that one because, as he's just pointed out, my specialism is with the estate itself and not really the wider Strathspey. And there are many people probably in this room who know a lot more about it than I do, but we'll do our best to go through this. And what I hope to do tonight is to give you a little bit of background about that, something about the estate and what we do, and talk around some of the current subjects that we've got in the rural land management sector that are exercising the minds of some people in and around the land management, particularly in Strathspey, not only ourselves but other land managers and landowners in the Strat. So probably the way to start is who owned Strathspey, and the family that own Seafield and Strathspey estates have been involved in this area for a very long time, as you can see, going right back to the 1400s. And the Grant family itself, who owned large tracts of Strathspey, as most of you here know better than I do. There is always the link with the Ogilvie family from Banffshire, Lower Banffshire, and you can see two examples of that in the 1400s, 1500s there, and again in the 1600s here, where there was marriages between the families. But it was only really at this point here where the Earl of Seafield's title moved across into the Grant line, following again yet another marriage in the 1700s over here. That brings us really much more up to the current day, and we see just through the last century who the current owners of Seafield and Strathspey are, and that's culminated just now with the current Lord Seafield and his family, the two sons, James Ogilvie Grant back in Reedhaven, and Alexander Ogilvie Grant, who's his second and younger son. So the subject of the talk is who owns Strathspey, and that was what I was asked to do. And so the white areas in red here that you can see are the remaining sections of Seafield and Strathspey estate, which of course at one point in time was much, much wider than it is just now, and used to extend down into what is now RSPB Abernethy, through Tulkin, into areas of Loch and Dor, right down the Spey through Rothes and into Elgin at one point in time as well. And they also owned estates out near Glenurquhart, which have all gradually been sold off over time. And we get down now to the core of the estates that are here. And as you can see, just in rough shape round about there, we're looking at all of our neighbours, of which there are certainly over 30 different ownerships that surround the current footprint of what is Seafield and Strathspey estates. They range in ownership from private individuals through to families, companies, trusts, communities, charities, and also government agencies. So there's the whole range here. There's no one type of landowner that you could see in the area. They are many and varied. As to the estates themselves, the two estates, of which I'll touch briefly on Cullen, but we'll concentrate mostly on Strathspey. The Cullen estate is about 12,500 hectares, and the remainder in Granton and Strathspey here is about 23,000 hectares in total between the two holdings. It's not owned in one vehicle. It is under several ownerships, as you can see here. So the majority of the Cullen estate is Lord Seafield as Seafield Estate, but there are also the Reedhaven Trust, which is the majority of the Strathspey estate, and then there are various partnerships and individual ownerships. We've got Old Cullen Farms, which is one of the in-hand farming operations. We have Seafield Rural, which operates a lot of the forestry. Viscount Reedhaven trades in his own right as a farmer, and we have some small trusts which are set up for the grandchildren, and we have a small limited company called Dava Enterprises, which runs some of the commercial aspects of the estate, and also a small holding for Mr. Ogilvie Grant and the Ogilvie Grant estate. The family are all resident, and Lord Seafield is resident in Cullen. Lord Reedhaven is in Strathspey, and Mr. Ogilvie Grant spends his time between his property in Strathspey and his business in London. So, what do we do? Seems like a silly question because most of you probably know, or at least think you know what we do. But the first thing to say is it's a family business. It is a mixed estate. We have farming, which we've talked about, mostly let land, but we have our own in-hand farming operations. Here up at Cullen, for example, where we're growing mostly barley for distilling and malting. And in Strathspey, the land type is such that we're actually much more onto livestock. And so we have our own small livestock operation in Strathspey. But as you can see there are about 40 let units on Strathspey still within the farming sector. In forestry in Strathspey, we have just over 7,300 hectares of plantations and native woodland, some of which I'll talk about later on as we go through. And a lot of that, as you'll be well aware, suffered depredations during the Second World War, and the structure of the plantations and woodlands is very heavily influenced by that, even yet, so far on post the Second World War. We have sporting and fishing operations. The fishing is fairly steady. The sporting is an awful lot less than we once used to do, and the amount of traditional sport that we do now has dropped dramatically from what it once was. We also do residential and commercial letting. We have gone into a lot more of environmental and conservation management, and we've touched into renewable energy, and there's also recreation, which has taken up another part of the estate, although we don't do any of that particularly in-house ourselves, other than linked to the sporting aspects and the fishing. So, are we a traditional estate? What is a traditional estate in these days? Things seem to have moved on quite a bit over the past several decades. It's true that we're very much still based on primary industries such as farming, forestry, that sort of thing. But in common with everybody else in the rural sector, a lot of what people might perceive as control is no longer in our hands, but it's actually taken into the hands of regulators. And a lot of what we do on the land now is actually controlled by regulation or by agencies. The amount which we can do without reference to a third party now is actually significantly reduced. One of the things which has come to the fore in recent years, and this is where we start to touch on the slightly political aspect, and looking at who else owns Strathspey, is some of the issues surrounding what people have referred to as green layers and the use of natural capital. And that is something which I'd like to explore a little bit, looking at it from our perspective, and to give you an insight into that as to how that is being picked up by land managers. What is this famed natural capital? The official definition, if you can find one, is something that's an asset that provides ecosystem services beneficial to our society and economy. Make of that what you will. From our point of view, we reckon that something along those lines, however you want to phrase it, is actually fundamental to the business and fundamental to land management. Because ultimately the family is intending on handing down the asset in the same or better condition to its successors. And that is where the sustainability aspect of this comes in. And that sustainability runs right the way across natural capital to community as well. We're looking at activities on the land which yield a flow of benefits to people through economic activity, which we just looked at in the previous slide, taxation, employment, but we have to remember again that what the estate is its business. It's a business that employs people both directly and indirectly, and the estate needs to generate income from that land to support the business and the flow of benefits, because a lot of the benefits that accrue from that will not be possible unless we can actually provide some sort of economic benefit at the end of the day. The other thing we should point out at this section is there are no external funds that come into Seafield and Strathspey estate. Everything that is generated from within the estate is exactly that. So the estate runs on the proceeds from its own footprint. There's no external funding coming in the way of charitable donations or from a business empire, as some of the other owners in Strathspey may have. It's done in-house and run on the land that's there, and that's what supports all of us, myself included. To try and explain a little bit about how this is being picked up, I'm going to use a couple of examples that we've got on the estate here. You may or may not be aware of the area at Kinvechy, which sits to the west of the A9. It was very much in the 1990s a traditional, if we use that word again, deer forest. It supported 5 keepers and was one part of the estate's, again, to use the word traditional, sporting operations at that time. It included accommodation in Kinvechy Lodge and was linked to other grouse shooting and fishing operations on the estate. In the late 1990s, it was always designated since the mid-1980s as a site of special scientific interest, which recognised its value in terms of its environment and its habitat. But in the late 1990s, the Natura designations came in from Europe, and what happened was that those designations meant that to comply, we had to make a significant change to the operation of the sporting element of the estate. And that was to change the amount of deer on the landscape and bring it down dramatically to allow the regeneration of the designated habitat, which was the woodland. That has impacts, and all land management changes have impacts, and you can see this through ourselves and other owners as we go through this talk. We ended up with loss of employment. The keepers went down from 5 to 3. We got severe criticism from our neighbours, who were all still very significant sporting operations, and did not like the fact that we were culling deer heavily, and we were criticised for shooting stags that they would otherwise have been able to take as sport. We then became much more reliant on public finances because we could not support the operations from the deer alone. It's a law of diminishing returns. The better you are at culling deer, the less income you get from the carcasses that you sell. There's also the issue that when you become reliant on public finances, it becomes very uncertain, as Bill will no doubt tell you. The grant scheme contracts that we can sign up to have got limited lengths, and every time you go to renew them, the goalposts have moved. It is a project which takes time and commitment to change things at a landscape scale, and it does come at a cost. It certainly doesn't come for free. It takes resources, and the core of those resources are the people that actually implement it on the ground. It's all very well for us as managers to do the paperwork behind it, but the hard graft on this is actually done by the people that you see in the picture there, who are doing this on the ground. Not only the deer culling, but the work that's involved in that, surveying, monitoring, management, all that takes time, effort and people. And a lot of those people are actually living in the community and are very, very core to that community. A couple of graphs, just to try and give us a perspective on it. When we started the project at Kinvechy in about 2000, the winter deer counts were over 40 deer per square kilometre. The recommended level for tree regeneration is less than 5 deer per square kilometre. And we were being looked at by the agencies, at that time Deer Commission for Scotland, and also the Forestry Commission, and SNH, as it was at that time, and they were saying, you need to bring the deer down. And so in 2005, we signed up to an agreement under what was then called a Section 7 order, which was basically a case of voluntary reduction of deer rather than the government stepping in and doing it for us, to bring the deer down on what was referred to as a reduction cull. And over a period of 3 years, the keepers involved in the estate took the deer down from winter counts in 2005 of about 20 odd per square kilometre to just about 5. And that was a huge effort and took a huge change in mindset from the staff on the ground to do that. From turning from a sporting estate, looking at culling animals that were sporting stags, to taking off really any animal that was a mouth that was going to damage the environment and the regeneration that was supposed to be taking place. It's not a short-term process. You can see there that in the past 10 years we've kept the average density of the deer at about 3 per square kilometre in that whole area of around about 6,000 hectares. But the first regeneration that we got that was of a size that we could actually claim any grant on was 10 years after the reduction cull stopped. It's a harsh environment out there. It's high, it has poor soils, it has slow growth rates, and through all that time it's still actually vulnerable to browsing from deer. We have had a success, as you can see in the bottom section there, but it's taken almost 20 years to get that success. We've now got a situation where all that hard work has paid off, in that we've got just under 400 hectares of new woodland in that area, and that's about 15% up on what was there when we started the project. And waiting in the wings, we've got probably another 100 hectares, which we know is of an age that will come through, and we'll continue to recruit to that. So we are expanding the woodland. But that was at a time before actually anybody was speaking about natural capital, or indeed about the whole carbon or biodiversity crises that we came to recently when the whole issue of the green layers raised their heads. it's not all about the woodland regeneration, it's about the things that actually work alongside the woodland. And one of the things that the estate's been very, very important in is conservation of the capercaillie, amongst other things. The designation at Kinvechy is for several species, including Scottish crossbill, crested tit, but we also have white-tailed eagle, osprey, merlin, black grouse, curlew, lapwing. We have golden eagle as well. We're fortunate enough to have 2 pairs breeding golden eagle on Kinvechy and 1 pair of white-tailed eagles. But as far as the estate's concerned, we also have 20% of the remaining population of capercaillie in the estate's footprint. The estate itself, again, before natural capital became a thing, was involved in conservation right from the early 1970s. It started when ospreys came back into the area, and their keepers at that point in time were involved in putting watches on osprey nests when people were still doing egg collecting. The estate itself saw the decline in capercaillie as early as the 1980s, and when it used to be a sporting bird and was shot for game, they put a voluntary ban on that themselves in the 1980s, and have been involved in the conservation efforts ever since to do that. You'll see there again that things have been fairly rocky for the capercaillie in recent years. We have managed to, at best, keep a stable population, which has been difficult in its own right. The brood counts are the young counts that we take at the end of the summer, and you'll see there the huge variety that we've got over the past sort of 20 years in terms of the recruitment that we get on the population. There is a magic figure in this. The magic figure for a capercaillie is the 0.6 figure you see there. And the received wisdom is that you need to get at least 0.6 chicks per hen recruitment to maintain a stable population. And I think that graph speaks for itself, and you can see how many years we've actually got to hit that marker. But the efforts still continue, and we do our level best, but the species conservation that we do is a very, very complex subject. And there are lots of people who have their own views on that, whether that be in the method of doing control or diversionary feeding. It gets quite heated at times in people's views on what is and isn't acceptable. But many of the factors that we deal with in terms of species management are actually out with our control. And it goes back again to the whole issue of legislation, in that we are really required to comply with rules and regulations that are given to us, some of which we agree with, some of which we don't, and we can lobby about that, and we put our efforts into the Scottish Government and agencies and make representation, but ultimately we receive the legislation, we don't make it. We're seeing a lot of pressure on public funding, and this is where some of the issues with the recent people who have come into the land management sector have encouraged the government, shall we say, to take a view that perhaps there is enough money out there to actually support some of these land management decisions without having to put money out of the public purse. We are, as land managers, being encouraged to seek private finance, either internal finance from ourselves or by looking for partners on external businesses or investors. The thing from our point of view is, as I mentioned earlier on, is that a lot of the internal income from our operations is vying with the land management for nature conservation in terms of generating a return. We look at it and say, where can we invest the money that we've made as a profit to generate a better return for the estate? And a lot we have to look at and say, well, if we put it into farming, we might get a better return than if we put it into nature conservation. And it's that balance that we have to look at. Because again, we, in common with a lot of other land managers, are stewards. It is part of what we do. It's not just a case of a business on there, it's stewardship as well. And in a lot of cases, you could liken the fact that although we have a scale, and we've just mentioned the total area, sort of 23,000 hectares, although we have a scale, we still are, in essence, the same thing as a family farm, is that we have to look at it and generate our business from the land, and stewardship is part of that. Farmers want to hand their land down to their successors. It's the same here. But that land has to go in good heart, and that's where the stewardship aspect comes in. In terms of getting external income, we have to look and say, well, what actually are we selling? We can sell a ton of timber, we can sell a ton of grain, and that's all tangible. And you know what it looks like, and you know what the market values it at. But when it comes to some of the more recent things that we're looking at in terms of natural capital, what is a ton of carbon? You can't grasp it. It seems to be quite ethereal. And that's very, very difficult to look at and make some sort of determination on. The market for grain or for timber is well established, we know about it, but the carbon market is very uncertain. It's a little bit, you almost think like sort of, I don't know, the South Sea bubble perhaps. There is uncertainty in terms of the carbon market because what in a lot of cases people are selling is promises. They're selling promises for future carbon stored from the operations that they're doing just now, whether that be peatland restoration, whether it be woodland creation and land management to do that. And those promises come with liabilities. And if you sell those promises now and then don't deliver on them, you still have a liability to find that carbon at a later date. The other thing that we're looking at is that with the drive towards carbon neutral, businesses are getting quite concerned about their carbon footprints and their carbon accounting. And if we do some of these things and create these ethereal carbon units, why would we sell them if we might actually need them ourselves to support the business in the longer term? We're experimenting. We don't want to do this and go wholeheartedly into it in the way perhaps that some landowners have, who are looking at it with an external investment and looking at it with business funding for whatever it is with their corporate social responsibility. We're very cautious about this. And we have had an area that's come back to us recently, which was a let grouse moor, and the tenant had worked for 10 years on that and decided that they weren't getting enough returns from that. They would get it back, and that meant that we took it back and the management came back into the estate. It's quite a concise and defined unit, and so as a test bed, it's a good case. So we looked at this and said, right, we will try to develop these income streams that everybody is telling us, that the Scottish Government is looking for us to develop, and say, we will trial this. The area, again, and this harks back to the situation with Kinvechy, when the land management changed there, all for the aims of natural capital. It employed 2 full-time keepers as a grouse moor and a part-time shepherd. And now, for the immediate future, that has gone, the 2 keepers have gone. Fortunately, we managed to recruit 1 to our own team, which was good. And we're doing seasonal grazing, and a basic level of maintenance on that ground is being covered by our estate team, who are still quite stretched. There's also a talk when we look at things like in comparison to Norway in terms of land ownership, and there was a talk over there about land abandonment and allowing natural processes to take place. Again, we don't think we can do that because that impacts again locally on the community and our agricultural structures. And we've also got to consider what's round about us in terms of our neighbours, but also the designations that we have and the impacts of abandoning land might have on the efforts that we have to control and produce on the neighbouring designated sites. It will come with a land use change, and this again is the direction that we're being asked to produce by Scottish Government. They're looking for this land use change, and that land use change will include moving to some woodland, but we will retain moorland management and agriculture, because we're looking again, if you like to hedge your bets, it's what a large landowner would do, is to have a range of options there, because as always, if one
sector is down, another sector might be up. And so balancing that risk between the different aspects of what we do on the estate and the different businesses that we have is actually important to us. So going all in for one thing is not a good outcome. And so what we'll do is we'll look at this and try to do multiple activities in this area. However, in the case of some landowners, and there are some who are neighbours to us, there is a safe model. And you can do it the way that the Scottish Government are looking at, which is a direction for regeneration without fencing and with deer control. And we've seen how much time and commitment that takes to do. Or you can put a fence round about it, exclude the deer, take the government grants, plant the trees, take the carbon credits, and it becomes an awful lot more, I wouldn't say easy, but it's more predictable to get an outcome from that than it is to do the second one there, which is control the deer and do it without fencing. If you do it that way, which is one of the ones that we do, so that is actually one of our sites that we planted back in 2014. If you do it that way, it is a one-type land use for a number of years. There's no mixed land use in there, it is just forestry. So there's no deer in there, we've excluded them. There's no grazing in there, we've excluded that. And it's trying to get that balance that we're looking at in the wider landscape. So this mixed model would be to integrate forestry and woodland grazing, to look at the management of the sward and open ground areas, and looking at addition of woodland into agricultural zones to get that mix, which should come through and provide benefits for all the business lines in there, if we can get it right. But, again, it comes back to the funding. How do we actually fund that operation? There's not a huge profit level in a lot of primary land-based activities. And again, as I said, we have to look at where that goes. If we take public grants, for example, the forestry grant scheme is not well set up to cater for natural regeneration. It makes it quite difficult. The planting model is very well structured, and people can use that, and they can do it in such a way at a scale that they can probably make something break even in terms of the planting and the costs of planting. Even if that's over sort of 5 or 10 years, the cash flow will work in such a way that they will probably break even with the government grants. But if you take natural regeneration and try to do that, you have an ongoing commitment year on year to put people on the ground, to control the deer, to get to a level that allows the trees to succeed. And you saw how long it took in the Convecchi model to actually get those trees there. And after 20 years they're still vulnerable. And that cost carries on through that period. Now there are positives to that, because we've got employment and we've got people on the ground. But there's also liabilities to that, because you've taken public grants, and if it doesn't work, you're responsible for paying them back. So that's something that pushes people towards the safe model at the end of the day. There's lots of landowners, like ourselves, who are willing to embrace change. But again, and I'm sorry to labour the point, but we have to view it through the lens of an existing business, with commitments to generate income to support that business and to maintain employment of the staff within that business. Where are the income streams to fund the change? Don't know. That project we're looking at in the outset, the new one that we're looking at, we're talking with many different partners to try and bring in income streams to that. The issue with that is that in a lot of cases it's the uncertainty. With the likes of the forestry grant scheme, as I said, the models are there and it's very safe and easy. But when you look at the issue of bringing in third parties and other aspects of that, it becomes very complicated. So investment will come, I'm sure, but it's not easy, and it it's likely that the market and the outputs will be such that it will be a pace that doesn't actually meet with this twin crisis that we have of biodiversity and climate. What is the incentive for private finance to invest in these things? We can see the situation with other landowners. If it's RSPB, for example, then it's a charity, charitable donations, that's fine, that's their remit, that's what their members pay them to do. But in this situation, what is it that we can do to attract an outside investor to invest in our habitat management? We've got a good story to sell. But a good story can be transient because people's views on that will change over time. Investors' focus will change. And as we said already, the carbon markets are uncertain. And many view that, to a certain extent myself included, as a little bit of smoke and mirrors sometimes. And there are also reputational concerns over greenwashing, is to use these carbon credits to cover up your pollution that you're doing anyway. So it's not straightforward in this, and it becomes very, very difficult. As I said there, the forestry grant scheme and agri schemes are a one-stop shop. When you start to bring in all these other funding streams, the incentive disappears. And we've all got a day job to do, and so the time you spend chasing all these different income streams is taking up time, and the temptation is to revert to default processes, or indeed not to change. And from the estate's perspective, and from land manager's perspective in the Strath, that is something which is potentially disastrous. Because the reason that the estate, I think, is still here today is because it's adapted as things have gone on through the years. We've adapted. And by adapting, you can survive. The woodland asset takes a long time, if we change it, to generate income. In Strathspey here, some of those young naturally regenerated areas, it'll be 30 plus years before we can actually see activity in them taking timber out and revenue being generated. And in the meantime, there's still management costs associated with that. So where are the short-term income streams? We haven't managed to sell a Capercaillie leaf since the 1970s. So, we started off with a question. I'm going to leave you with a question. And that is, we started off with who owns Strathspey. And I'm going to ask you whether or not it actually matters who owns Strathspey, or does it actually matter more how they manage it? And on that point, I will open the floor to questions, and you can ask your own questions of me.
I have a question on the woodlands. You said there's nearly 400,000 square acres.
About 7,300 hectares of woodland in Strathspey on the
and that's a mix of old forest or species as well as logging.
Yes.
So you get
Yes.
one from the other.
Yeah.
So are you trying to keep at that level? Because I mean you're taking some logs out, and so you're going to have to put more into to cover that. That's the first question. The second one is, you know how there's quite a few charities around that have regeneration of forests themselves. If you were to give money to them as the charity, could you get something back in return? In the sense of you're actually providing something to them, therefore you can get an offset of some kind.
Two questions. I'll take the first one and say that yes, in terms of the estate, it's actually about 30% by area of the estate is forestry, and that is higher than average in a Scottish context, because the sort of average in Scotland is about 19% land cover in forestry. And so the estate, as a land holding. I mean, it's fair to say, because I mean the grants have been into forestry in Strathspey since the 1700s. I mean, they were big in terms of their forestation. They've always been keen on the trees. But in terms of that, they are unusual as a land holding because they have significant forestry. In that sense, yes, we intend to keep the mix about right. There are some areas where we will increase, and we've actually got a new plantation going in just near Drummuley at the moment, about 65, 70 hectares worth of new woodland going in there, as well as the regeneration that's taking place in Kinvechy. But again, a lot of what we're doing in Kinvechy is actually simply replacing trees which were lost during the Second World War, and the whole area there was subject to quite a significant fire in 1946, immediately after the logging took place over there, and that destroyed a lot of the woodlands. The processes that we're using in Strathspey are and will be somewhat different from the traditional clear fell and restocking. Is that a lot of what we're doing here will go back to the traditional aspects of what the estate used to do, which was leaving an overstory and seeding trees by natural regeneration. So the area of woodland will continue. We will cycle it, so there'll be areas which will be thin and allowed to regenerate, but essentially the aim for the estate is a sustainable outturn of timber at the end of the day. Now, between the two estates, we're putting out in the region of between 30 and 35,000 tonnes of timber a year, and roughly speaking, around about 10 to 15,000 tonnes of that comes from the Strathspey woodlands. But they are much slower growing, and so the rotation to trees that we've got in Strathspey for pine will be in the sort of 70 to 90 year range, whereas on the lower ground and better soils, we're looking at them doing sort of 40 to 55 years. And so that's a long-term investment, and to do that you have to have sustainability to make sure that you've got that coming through.
Sure.
And that works at a whole range of levels for some of the businesses that then rely on that timber and rely on the work in harvesting and marketing that timber.
But look, can I say the real value of wood would be going up because it's becoming more and more scarce?
The real value wood went up. It's come back down again just recently. Yeah, and we've seen the change in the economy slow things down, and so there's been downward pressure on timber prices recently as well. But as far as the mix of that 7,300 hectares is concerned, about 5,000 of that, just under 5,000 of that is plantation, and the balance is what we would refer to as native woodland. But of that 7,300 hectares, around about 71% of it is Scots pine. And so there's that in terms of the mix. Predominantly pine, predominantly native species in the area, and that's a product of historical situation, but also the soils and types of trees that can grow in this area. The second thing, you would have to ask the charities that. They I think would say that you're getting your benefit from them protecting that environment, and that's why a lot of people subscribe to these charities.
Yeah.
And there are some very good charities out there. RSPB and Woodland Trust are doing some really good things in terms of the woodland management and habitat management, not just for the woodlands, but all the species that go with it. And this is part of the mix that we've got. Is we're trying not to look at things on a silo basis, so we're not looking at something and saying that this is the benefit here. We're looking at it and saying this is the benefit, but the spin-off is. So all the work that we're doing for Capercaillie will benefit other ground nesting birds, and it's that breadth that we're looking at in terms of the habitat management.
Excellent. Thank you.
What's your impression of Cairngorm Connect, and would you like to participate in it?
Yeah, I mean, Cairngorm's Connect is a good venture. It has scale, and this is one of the things that there is often discussion about in Scotland, is the large amount of land that's owned by a small number of people. But Cairngorm's Connect is a very good example of what can happen at scale, and it's something which we sometimes see ourselves in looking at the way that land is managed. Sometimes it's easier to do things at scale than it is if the land is broken up into small parcels. That doesn't mean to say that there shouldn't be small parcels of land and that people should get access to it. And that again is one of the things that I think we're seeing perhaps I hope more recognition of is that there are ways that we can manipulate that so that it depends again, as I was saying there, does it matter who owns it or does it matter what's done with it? And access to people for leasing areas of ground, for example, might be something that helps. But in terms of Cairngorms Connect, we, I suppose, participate at a wider scale. We're not part of Cairngorms Connect itself, but we share a lot of the same values as they do in terms of management of the habitat. And they are a good example of a private sector and public sector partnership, with looks at the private sector from Anders Paulsen, we look at it from Wildland Limited, we look at it from the RSPB, and then both Forestry and Land Scotland and Nature Scot, all partners in that, and all looking to deliver the same thing. So I think it's a good vehicle.
Is a 200-year planning horizon too long for an estate like the one you're managing?
I would say that you have to break that down into different phases. And so there are different plans, and the other thing you've got to do is you've got to react. So in a lot of cases, our planning is done on an annual basis, but it's also done on 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then there's a longer term vision which is very broad brush. And it's good that, and I've seen it done with Mar Lodge Estate. In a previous existence, I used to do some work for NTS at Mar Lodge, and they also at that time, when I was dealing with them in the late 90s, early 2000s, had a 200-year vision. And I think that as an aim is very good, but there are lots of shorter term plans that you have to put in place to actually get you there.
You mentioned grants and some having to be paid back.
Yes.
Where do the grants come from? And is that the case? In every case you have to pay them back?
No, it's not in every case. The ones I was referring to predominantly were the Scottish Forestry grants, so what was the Forestry Commission grants. If you do not deliver, the contract that you have with them is that if you fail to deliver, you are liable to pay the grant back. So that colours people's judgment in how much risk they're willing to take in doing a grant or taking a grant scheme on. And that's one of the major concerns for us, is that if something goes wrong, and sometimes, as I've said before, it's out with our control, then we have to look at that and say, are we willing to accept that risk that we may have to pay the grant back? Now, an example of that is that we are looking at, we've used the Kinvecchi project as an example. We're doing large-scale control there of deer, and all our neighbours surrounding us, and in most cases it's interesting to know that they've actually changed. So a lot of these estates round about us, and this goes back to the Who and Strathspey, have changed hands in that 20-25 year period that we've been operating. And we've seen Kinrara Estate, for example, go from a sporting estate to what it is just now with the Lost Forest and Brewdog. We saw the Clune Estate change hands, and that went from stag stalking to grouse, and that meant that they were actually even harder on the deer than we were in some cases. So we've seen those changes come through. But we've got a plantation that I mentioned earlier on, just going ahead just now, which sits next to a neighbour who is wholly forestry. And our decision there was that we could not do that by deer control alone, because we have agricultural ground on one side, we have forestry on the other, and we have no ability to control the deer within the forestry of our neighbours. And if we didn't deer fence that, we were again putting Scots pine in, so it's a native woodland plantation. And in that situation, what we would look at is that they would just simply hop over the fence, shoot the trees, hop back again. And that means that we've got all the pain for that. So the only way we could do that and reduce the risk was to completely fence it. And that's a decision that we have to take. The other thing which is quite interesting, and it leads on from some of the points that were being made earlier on, is the balance between the natural woodland and building a resource. And there's been a lot of work done. And again, if it's a charity and that is their reason to be, that is fine, because that's what their members want. But from my perspective as a land manager, I sometimes see missed opportunities in that. And for example, the case that I gave there, where we're looking at new woodland creation, yes, a lot of it will be natural regeneration, but there'll be areas within that that we'll choose to plant, and we'll plant it at a density which will produce commercial timber, and that's the balance. So we'll pick the best soils and the most suitable sites, and we'll generate, hopefully, an asset for the estate in the future. And that's when it comes back to the long-term vision. Because again, particularly in relation to forestry, and I'm sorry to keep going back to that, that is my background. That's the faith in the future. That's when your 100-year or 200-year vision comes in. And you say, if we do something now, it will be the next generation or the generation after that which will actually benefit from it. Because in that situation, if we plant that now, it will be probably 25, 20, 55, 20, 60 before there's anything really coming out of that as a woodland. But it's still an asset that we create for our successors.
You mentioned in Somerville Forest doing selective cutting and relying on natural regeneration in the canopy, which sounds really good from somebody walking through the landscape and such forth. But does that give you an added headache in terms of having to maintain fencing, presumably over a much longer period, to deter the browsing?
Yes, it does. It does, and again, it's back to the safe model. So the fence, prepare the ground and replant is a safe model. But fencing these days in itself is quite expensive. So it's not, it's getting that balance between the two things. And the other thing that we've got with natural regeneration is that it doesn't work everywhere, or it doesn't even work on timescales that we would like everywhere. And a lot of the plantations that we have, we may choose to try natural regeneration in them, but at some point we may have to say, well, it's just not working, and then revert to a planted model. There's a lot of it, I'm going to get a bit technical here, but there's a lot of areas in Strathspey where the understory in the pine woodlands is very heavily dominated by grasses, and that makes things difficult to regenerate, particularly in respect of pines. And in some cases we might have to do a mixed model on that and do a bit of regeneration, but then if it's not getting to the stocking density that we want, we may have to go back in and add trees in to get it to a condition whereby we can get productive timber out of it at the end of the day. So the chap at the very back.
You were talking about the long-term regeneration plans for the estate and long-term planning in general, which you have to do with forestry. But with new generation of the Grant family coming up, how committed do you think the family are to Strathspey in the long term with maintaining ownership? Strathspey is fairly fragmented now. My understanding is producing a diminishing return. Do you think the family will continue to operate it as they've done, and that's the long-term plan?
Yes, I think they do, and I think that's inherent in the commitment that they've got to look at new ways of generating income from the land. That's why they're doing things like the test case that we explained there, is they're adapting. They have sold off large areas undoubtedly, but I think the family commitment, and I don't think I know the family commitment remains. I know certainly that Viscount Reedhaven is very committed to the estate and to the history of the estate in particular. So I have no doubts about that it will continue. How it will continue, it will change, there's no doubt. But then you've seen that change in all of our neighbours. It's not just us that has to change. All the neighbours, all the landowners that we have round about us, those 30 plus landowners you've seen change over the years. And they have to adapt to changing circumstances, and we're no different. I said to begin with, you could look at it this way: our business is land-based, and that comes with stewardship. But at the end of the day, are we that much different from someone who's running a business out of a large industrial portal shed on an industrial estate? It's just a question of scale. We're still a business, and that really is the bottom line. And the only difference, as I say, comes with the fact that we have perhaps a wider responsibility and I think the family are more than aware of that responsibility in terms of the stewardship and what the impact on the land is.
I'm interested in who takes the decisions for the estate. Is it Lord Seafield, Lord Reedhaven, or is it you?
It's a combination of all three.
And how's the hierarchy established? Do you have committee meetings?
I'm at the bottom.
Dukes and Earls and then
No, it's much more of a level structure than that in terms of the decision making. What happens is that in terms of Strathspey in particular, there are 2 meetings a year that we have with the trustees in particular, and that includes Lord Reedhaven and Lord Seafield and 2 other trustees. And at that meeting we present as management our recommendations to them, and they then review that and they give us instruction as to whether or not they're happy with that or what the direction they want us to take. So there's that, but there's also day-to-day contact. So if there's something happens during the day, we're very, very fortunate in that sense that we don't have a board as such, we don't have a committee. We have direct, as management, we have direct access to our principals. And if we want to discuss something with them, and we think there's something that needs raised, then we can go direct to them straight away and raise something with them and get a view on it from them. So it's a good place to work. And I've worked in other places with board structures and with committee structures, and this is a far easier place to get management decisions made than some places that I've worked.
Thank you.
there was a question.
You
Right.
expressed some reluctance about carbon and biodiversity credits because of the latent liability if the scheme's not successful. But as a landowner, land manager, wouldn't you be in a better position to just rent out the land base to an enterprise, a partnership that would come in and plant the trees and manage the crop and sell the credits, and you wouldn't have to take on that liability?
Yeah, it would be nice if it was just that simple. But somebody who comes in is not going to pay you a significant amount for that, because the liability then falls to them. And so the rental they're likely to pay you is diminished because they're taking on a liability. And that really is the issue behind it, is who takes the liability. And the person who takes the liability is going to pay a much reduced rent if that liability is there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I know we're talking about shifting liability, but if somebody else takes the liability, granted the value of the land base goes down, but you're sort of saying you don't want to take the liability to start with.
Yeah, I'm not saying we don't want to take the liability, we're just very, very aware of the liability. So if we take a situation where we sell carbon credits, so let's just say we did that. Let's say we rented the land to someone and they did something on that whereby they then sold the carbon credits. They have a finite lease on that area of ground, and if we don't sell it to them but we lease it to them, when that land comes back to us, the liability comes back to us as well. And unless we get the lease absolutely correct to begin with, if they sell off, for example, those carbon credits, and the land comes back to us after they've finished their lease, and we find that at the end of the lease the carbon isn't there, that liability returns to us.
I'll give you my business card.
I'd be pleased to discuss that with you. One example that I did see, which was not on the estate, but which was on a woodland that we went to look at with the potential for purchasing, was exactly something similar, which was that the people who owned the woodland had sold the carbon credits, the pending issuance units off, and it was linked to an area of broadleaf woodland. And when I went to look at it, they sold these carbon credits, they were responsible for this, but the woodland had succumbed to ash dieback, and so actually the disease had got in, reduced the number of trees, and substantially reduced the carbon sequestration on that area of ground. And whoever it was that was going to buy that woodland would have to buy it with that liability, and either having to then restock that area of woodland at cost, or accept the fact that they have to go onto the market and at some point in time in the future acquire credits to compensate for the loss that has been sold. It's a very, very tentative market that we're getting into here. We are dabbling in it, but we're going at it very, very cautiously.
How about tourism?
Tourism. Not something we do a lot of ourselves. We do a lot with the fishing and the sporting. So we have our guests in Invernaland and our day guests on the rivers. We've got the 4 beats running up from Castle Grant all the way up to Kinhurdy. And we do quite a good amount of tourism in that, a lot of which actually spins off into the community. And that again is where the estate operations will support other businesses. So it's not just what our business does, it's the impact we have on other businesses. And so although we provide some accommodation linked mostly to Beat 2 within the estate, and that's at Invernaland, a lot of the other guests and fishers who come here will take up residence in other establishments in the Strath, and so there's spin-off benefits to them as well. We found it very, very difficult over the years to actually provide any sort of income from direct tourism and recreation. It tends to be that there are businesses out there who do it better than we do. And we have our own specialisms within our management team, and we stick to those. And we tend to act probably more as facilitators rather than actually running tourism businesses ourselves. We've got a number of small leases that we do with Instinct Guides, for example, and there's a company comes across and does occasional tourism drives through certain parts of the estate, things like that. So we will give permission for people to take access to the estate and take a small payment from them for that. But generally speaking, we don't do that in-house. It's not our specialism. And again, because of things like the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, it becomes quite difficult to monetise that. People have come to us and said, well, why don't you do car parks? And why don't you charge for car parks? Well, if you look at the Forestry and Land Scotland model, they do car parks. I don't think they make an awful lot of money off of it. So it's not something we can think has got a great degree of return for the estate. We'll concentrate on the things that we are good at, and we'll support other businesses who are better at making money at tourism than we are.
To answer your question, don't we all own Strathspey?
Yes, you do.
In many
Ultimately,
ways,
at the end of the day,
and
yeah.
we're all responsible for it as well.
Yes, we are. I think that's a very good point. It comes back again to who's responsible for it as well as who manages it. We see situations with recreational access, and it was one of the things when we were doing the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, when it came in after the Land Reform Act in 2003 and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code was being drawn up, my view at that time was it was a fantastic document. It really was. But it works for 90% of people, and it's the 10% of people that cause you the problems.
I never think that,
Yeah, probably in life in general, I think, probably isn't it? But the majority, we have a lot of good and responsible and well-recognised recreational access. And there's a lot of responsible people out there who take access responsibly in line with the Outdoor Access Code. That are the ones that cause the problem. We were to give you an example, and again, it goes back to the Capacary situation. In the area at High Burnside above Aviemore, on the face of there, certainly I was concerned about the number of mountain bike trails that were being developed in there and the impact that might have on the Schedule 1 species. But it always was difficult for me to actually find a way into the mountain biking community because it's such a disparate community, very much sort of individual sense. And it was actually one of the Nature Scot officers who came to me with an idea and said, well, why don't you just convene a group of the mountain biking business owners that have got mountain biking shops, and some of the ones there, because they are the peer group. If you get into them, then they might spread the word for you. And that actually worked quite well, because one of the things that I was considering at that point in time was to actually formalise some of the trails in that area. And it was only through working with the mountain biking community that I actually got enough background from them to say that that wasn't the best way to deal with that, because it wasn't that class of mountain biker that was using that area. It was a specific subset of mountain bikers that were using that area. And if I had gone and done it with what I was wanting to do, all I'd have done was actually increase the number of less able mountain bikers, increase the pressure, but working with the mountain biking community, getting that input from them, meant that they've actually got on board now. They themselves have raised their knowledge and awareness of their impact on the environment in that area, and it's actually been to the benefit of both us as the estate and them as a mountain biking community, and also to ultimately at the end of the day to the species that are up there, that we found a way through. And that was facilitated in a large case by Nature Scott and also by the Kapakele project that was run through the National Park.
In
So-
many ways, it comes back to that bit of ownership, and not ownership, not in,
Yeah.
not in physically ownership,
Yeah.
but ownership and being part
Part
it,
of, yeah.
involved in
And
it.
involved in, and that is a big part of it as well, is the involvement in it, and the recognition that you gain benefit from it as well. So it may be owned by the Ogilvy Grant family, but there are plenty of people enjoying it and making use of it, and more part of it.
What would happen if you just walked away?
Oh,
What,
good question.
what's the final scenario? You think, we've had enough of this. We're going to just leave it, walk away,
39 people would lose their jobs.
back to nature.
39 people would lose their jobs, and that's the starting point. That's
a start.
the immediate thing that comes to mind to me as the person responsible for this is the people who would lose their jobs. And going back to the comment about land abandonment, there were reasons why in Norway that happened, and there was retrenchment and all the rest of it. But I don't think we can afford to abandon land in Scotland. I think that if you let's take the situation of Kinvechy, because I know that quite well, and we look at all the owners that were round about it. Now that was 6,000 hectares in a fairly distinct block. If we had walked away from that, it certainly wouldn't be what it is today. Because the pressures that were there in the late 1990s would have continued, and it would have continued to hold deer, it would have continued to be browsed. There would be no level of regeneration in that now if we had just walked away from it. And we would certainly have less employment, and we would certainly have a less diverse species structure in that area than we currently have.
So the answer to that is don't.
Yes, but with a caveat, is that sometimes the temptation to actually manage is not a good thing. And I'll give you another example of that, is that, and again, I'm sorry it comes back to forestry. Back at the beginning of the Kinvechy project, when we were seeing the first signs of regeneration, some of them were looking very, very sickly. And I was doing a lot of canvassing we do a lot of educational work with groups that come to the estate, and we're doing another example probably in March with the University of Highlands and Islands, who are using Kinvechy as a case study and bringing their pupils down there to do education on that, along with other land managers. And at that point, I was looking at that and saying, should I be putting some sort of effort into this? Should I be breaking the ground up? Should I be scarifying things? Should I be disturbing the ground? Should I be fertilising some of these trees because they look so sickly? And I looked at that, and I sought advice from other land managers, and the general impression was, don't do anything, give it time. And that's something that we all think in terms of land management have to recognise, is that sometimes it does take time. And the temptation to get in there and fiddle with it actually isn't the correct thing to do. Leave it, monitor it, and then just give it time. And sometimes nature will sort it out for you.
And I'm conscious of time, and I think there'll probably be a lot of questions you'll not get out. But I just wondered, could you go back to the slide of all the different estates that are round about, just to kind of conclude on that, just to get a wee look at just the
Oh.
Aye.
So, starting at the top, we've got Nakando and Ballandalloch Estate, we've got Tolkien, we've got Annagoth Woods, we've got Congish Farm, Rivet Lodge, we've got Curwood in here, there are private farms in through here, we've got Scottish Natural Heritage at Abernethy, RSPB, Altgurish, which is private forestry owned, Bachulish Estate, Rothiemurchus, Kinrara running up here, this is Kinvechy in here. Two parts of the Clue Estate here, Corrybroch, Balnespit, Codder. There's various private forestry owners in through here. There's a Yule family at Duffel, Gordon Woodlands Limited. This section in here is actually private farms again. Robert McNeil in the area that the estate sold off through the back of Dramulli there at Desher. And again, private ground in here, I think, which was part of Rivik Estate at one point in time. And in recent times, we've got changes of land ownership even in areas that the estate used to own at Dorbick and Rivik, which has been just purchased by Oxygen Conservation, another charity who are looking at environmental management. And there's a lot of that being taken over. But it's also interesting to know that even some of the ones that have taken over and gone on to the carbon side, I mean, the Far Ralia, for example, that was bought, planted, and is now back on the market again. So the question is, is it a short-term thing? And to a certain extent, looking at it from our perspective, there does appear to be a bit of a time lag, and the Scottish Government are looking at this whole natural capital thing and seeing people moving into it, whether it be Aviva down at Glendy or whether it be Aberdeen in Faralia, and saying that they're doing this for corporate social responsibility and they're doing it to do carbon offsets. But I think the market's moved since then. I don't think there's quite the same amount of private funding out there now, or the same intent as there was several years ago. And I think we've seen that in terms of the land values as well, and the land values have definitely come back in the past 2 or 3 years from the peak, say possibly in where are we now, 25? That's about 2019, 2020, when there was a very big bubble in terms of the natural capital aspect.
Now, there you are.
A big benefit in the fact for everybody that the family do own the estate, because I speak to a lot of other tenant farmers about working with companies who have got agencies in that set the rent or whatever is on, and they don't have the same go and come with them as it is because you have got continuity. I speak to a lot of people who are on the Speyside Way and roundabout, and they say this area around here is great for recreation because everybody it's got to do with the responsibility from the state are there to try and help you and keep you going, whereas when you go to other areas where there's agencies running it, gates locked, you can't go this way, you've got to go that way. And they don't get that here. So I think everybody, it's not just us as tenant farmers, but everybody that's in the area, whatever way you used the land, benefits because it's family.
And thank you for that.
What a wonderful endorsement.
Can I just come back on that, because I think you hit the nail on the head with one word there, which was continuity. And I think that's what makes a big difference, is the continuity. And a lot of the uncertainty that people are facing comes from change. And if that continuity is there, there is definitely a benefit in that. And one of the things, as you'll know from the point of view of the tenant farmers, one of the things that the estate prides itself on doing is regular reviews and regular contact with the tenants to make sure that there's that relationship between us and the people that are in partnership with us effectively and who are renting the ground from us. And that is a value that the estate holds highly. And I'm not saying that it's never got problems, but it is something that the estate prides itself on, and that continuity is something in terms of both its relationships, but also its reputation, is something that it really wants to keep and focus on.
Thank you very much. And I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Will for what's been a wonderful, open, honest presentation.
Thank you.